Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky problem solvers and misfits of all stripes. I am your intrepid host, Andrew Heaton. Welcome. In 2023, a tanker truck flipped over while going through an underpass, spilling 8,500 gallons of gasoline, which ignited, instantly killing the driver and resulting in such a hellish conflagration that it melted the steel beams of the bridge above it. That bridge collapsed, severing I-95, a major artery in the U.S. highway system. Normally, 160,000 vehicles crossed that bridge every day. Incapacitated, this meant an insane level of traffic congestion and car pileups for miles. If you've ever lived in a place with a crucial highway system, it's I-35 where I grew up, you know how incredibly irritating it is when highway maintenance causes traffic congestion for months or years. But that's maintenance, planned maintenance. This was a disaster, an unplanned disaster in Pennsylvania on a pivotal East Coast highway system. The Secretary of Transportation for that state warned that fixing the bridge would take between 12 months and 24 months. Which by my calculation is 1 to 2 years. So picture that irritating planned highway expansion near you. Now imagine that it's random, unplanned, and it's going to take up to 2 years. 2 years of horrible traffic delays. 2 years of getting stuck in one random town every time you drive north to south. Shout out to Waco, Texas, which for some reason was a blood clot of the highway system for 3 years every time I wanted to drive from Austin to Oklahoma City because of highway stuff. But again, that was planned. That was maintenance. We're talking about a disaster here that's not planned. It's going to take 1 to 2 years. And most of that time, the 1 to 2 years, most of that time would not actually be the construction, the building of the bridge. Most of it would be satisfying regulations. Hiring a consultant, accepting bids from contractors, environmental impact statements, design approval from the Federal Highway Commission, procurement rules, red tape. The governor of Pennsylvania issued an emergency declaration exempting the bridge project from the normal plodding proceduralism which governs infrastructure. The government prioritized speed and even a little bit of risk over methodical, painstaking regulatory hurdles. Leaders in the project were given greater discretion to make their own decisions at the expense of well-meaning rules which usually ensure that everything is perfunctory and by the book. And the result was, rather than taking 1 to 2 years, Pennsylvania was able to repair the bridge in 12 days. If things had gone normal, by the book, adhering to governmental red tape, the highway would have taken at least a year. When exempted from that red tape, when speed was prioritized over punctiliousness, traffic was up again and running in a little under 2 weeks. It's an anecdote from the book that we are going to be discussing with my guest today. But first, I want to tell you why I'm interested in that book, why I'm interested in my guest. Number one, the Democratic Party is doing a lot of soul searching at the moment. One side of the tent is the group who's hostile to markets and business, who think that the Democrats keep losing because they keep fielding Republican light. And the best strategy to take back power from the Republicans is to nominate folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, rehabilitate and embrace the term socialism. The other camp thinks Democrats are losing elections because we keep giving the spotlight to irritating, pointy-headed leftists that piss off wide swaths of moderates and independents, like Heaton. We need to be the big tent party of pragmatism and technocrats, and yes, markets. This camp, I think, includes Matt Iglesias, Ezra Klein, and Derek Thompson, who you will hear from today. That is my analysis. So partly, I want to get a feel for what this side of the Democratic Civil War looks like. But that's not actually the main reason that I tracked down today's guest. The main reason is this. I, Andrew Heaton, an independent, want a small but competent government. Ideally, I want the government to be unobtrusive enough and, crucially, functional and smart enough that I just don't think about it a lot. But where we have a government, and I do want there to be a government, I want it to function smoothly and intelligently. I want a limited government, but I also want good government. As a taxpayer, I want me and my fellow taxpayers to get maximum bang for buck in the taxes we pay. I want our government to be the best possible stewards of our money. My guest makes a compelling case that our government is too bureaucratic, a position I have held myself for quite some time. But he goes and says, yes, that's true in terms of the private sector, but it's also true in terms of the public sector, the government imposing regulations on itself, which hamstrings officials from being able to do the things they got elected to do. This and a new way to think about research funding right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Derek Thompson. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic, and along with his co-author, Ezra Klein, he is the author of Abundance, the book we will be discussing today. You can find that book as well as all of the books we discuss in this program by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. Hello, Derek.
Hi. Good morning or good afternoon to you, depending on where you are.
It's morning for me.
Okay.
But I like that you're being global in your outlook.
Thank
All
you.
right, so I'm going to toss something at you, Derek. Having read the book, I came up with a bumper sticker that I think is incredible, like irritatingly reductive to the fine work that you have done, but I think does a pretty good job of summarizing it. I want you to tell me where I get wrong about this. If I just sum up your book,
to be reduced. So yeah, hit me with it.
Great. If I was going to make a bumper sticker about your book, it would be cut regulation and increase research funding. Is that like if I got the main bits, or you're like, no, you failed to understand my book?
Look, I sometimes say that books have to pass the broken elevator test, which is to say that if someone says, explain me your book in 5 seconds, as if you're going from the lobby of the building to the first floor of the building, you have to succeed based on an elevator test of 1 floor. But also, it's the broken elevator test because a book takes about 8-9 hours to listen to on audiobook on Audible or Spotify. So if the elevator breaks down, you need to keep people entertained for that 8 to 9 hours. There's no way to capture the essence of a book in those 5 seconds, but you are right in so far as a part of the book is about what I would call deregulating not just the market, but deregulating government itself. Government has put so many strictures on its own ability to achieve its ends, and in particular to achieve progressive ends, that it's really important to think from an outcomes-based process, what is it the government wants to achieve, and how do we build the processes that allow government to achieve that? That's a huge part of the book. There's another big part of the book that is, as the second half of the bumper sticker alludes to, about science and technology, which begins with research. Unfortunately, a lot of research that the Trump administration is destroying at the moment. So regulations and research, to the extent that we are interested in alliterative summaries to abundance, regulation and research is not the worst, sort of 2-word summary to throw at me.
Well, terrific. Those are the things that I most want to talk to you about. We can absolutely expand on them. There are some terms that I first want to go over to make sure that I get what's going on. You refer to adversarial legalism several times in the book. What is adversarial legalism, and why is it a problem?
Adversarial legalism is this idea that there's a lot of legal strictures in the U.S. that get in the way of governments or businesses doing or building on behalf of the people. So, for example, if you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, and even before that, the 1930s, with the rise of the New Deal, the U.S. was building like crazy. And a lot of what we were building was absolutely helping people, whether it was roads or dams or the Tennessee Valley Authority, providing rural electrification. It was really wonderful how much the U.S. was able to build on behalf of the public. But all of that building tended to be fueled by burning stuff that we found in the ground. And so we were creating a toxic planet, or at least creating a toxic climate where we were building. And so, in places like Los Angeles or New York, you saw enormous smog problems. And then in the rivers and lakes of Ohio and New Hampshire, they were either being lit on fire or, running red, green, and blue based on the textiles that were being dumped into the river. And so we came up with new strictures, new environmental rules, and new legal customs in order to make it harder to build in the world. But we created a legal culture that has become very adversarial to the government, that has made it very, very difficult for the government to achieve its goals, whether it's building housing or building energy. And one of the most important figures in this adversarial legal movement was Ralph Nader, famously ran for president in 2000 and a couple other years. But I mentioned 2000 because it was that year when Jim Lehrer at CBS asked him, Why is it that you think you are uniquely supposed to be president? What makes you uniquely qualified to be president? Ralph Nader didn't say, oh, it's because I'm the smartest or I have the best vision for what America could be. He said, it's because no one has sued the government more than I have. That is adversarial legalism. That is lawyers, even progressive lawyers, defining their identity and defining their progressive bona fides by how many times they can stop the government from doing stuff. And if that is your legal custom, you're going to get very, very good at the politics of blocking, but you won't get very, very good at the politics of building. And so if you look at places like New York or California, Oregon, Washington, a lot of the most productive and rich states that are governed by Democratic mayors or Democratic governors, they tend to have a really hard time building sufficient housing and energy and infrastructure. And that, I would say, is the fallout of adversarial legalism.
One of the things you bring up in the book that I was surprised to learn and made me think was that the United States has twice as many lawyers per capita as Germany and 4 times as many lawyers per capita as France. And that part of that, as you indicate, I think, is that we have a lot of effort that is put into suing the government, oftentimes to stop the government from building things.
And often to stop the government from building things that they shouldn't build. I mean, one of the ironies of this revolution that we point out is that it really picks up in the 1960s, 1970s. It's those decades when the population of lawyers starts to grow at something like 2 to 3 times X the general population. Before that, there had really never been a decade when the population of lawyers so dramatically expanded relative to the overall population. But it's this era of the 1960s, 1970s, where you just have an enormous number of lawyers come online or start to work at law firms. And I think it's really important to be clear here about a profound irony. In many cases, they were responding to very real issues. These were progressive lawyers who wanted to support the Civil Rights Act of 1965, or to sue, laws that grew out of the Jim Crow South. Or in the world of environmentalism, they wanted to stop industry from polluting the water or polluting the air. There were a lot of lawyers in this period, sort of the beginning of the second half of the 20th century, that got into law for good progressive reasons. But one thing that happens, Andrew, I think, is that without an ability to take stock of how the world changes, we see over and over again that the solutions of one generation become the problems of another generation. And all of these rules that we began to write in the 1960s and 1970s, not just the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but in particular in the realm of environmentalism, the National Environmental Policy Act, and many of the different legal rules that make it easier for neighbors to sue the government or businesses to stop what's being built around them. All of these things come online, and it just makes it very, very difficult for the government to respond to the public's need to build in the world. And I think it's important just to be clear about the costs of this. It's not just that we have a national housing crisis, although we do. It's also that in the richest cities and most productive cities, where so many people in the middle or lower classes want to live so that they can work their way up into the middle and upper class, we've made it impossible to own or rent a home. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., it is prohibitively expensive in these places. And it's in part because they have created this thicket of rules that make it hard for the supply side of the economy to react to the demand side of the economy. So more people are wanting to live in these cities, but we're not building enough housing to meet that demand. And it's created a world in which, if you look at the rates of homelessness and where they're highest, the 5 states with the highest rates of homelessness, like California, Oregon, New York, they tend to have Democratic governors. And so, Ezra and I are liberals, and we want liberalism to be responsive to the public and the public good. And that's why we want to take seriously the fact that there's an irony that we built this system of laws about 60 years ago to make it difficult to build in the physical world. But now, in fact, we need to build in the physical world, and we need a new era of institutional renewal to do essentially what the environmentalists in the 1960s did, which is to respond to the problems of the age.
A friend of mine, Jeremiah Johnson, summarizes, I think, what you're saying. You're nodding too. I think you know Jeremiah. Where he says, in the 60s, it was stopping bad things. In the 2000s, it's building good things. Like we have to focus on proactive building solar plants, building houses, things like that. Whereas in the 60s, as you point out, it's like there were rivers that were on fire. We needed to stop that. It was a defensive action. Now it's a proactive offensive action. Um,
Yeah.
I'm with you.
That's a great summary. That's a great summary. Another way that Noah Smith, who's a wonderful writer, put it is that the 1960s, 1970s, it's as if we placed a bunch of landmines in front of industry so that industry couldn't walk across that territory. And now there are home builders who want to walk across that territory. There are solar and wind power developers who want to walk across that territory, but the landmines are still on the ground. And so ironically, by halting the advance of an industry that we wanted to halt in the 1960s, we are halting the progress of industries we want to accelerate in the 2020s.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about some of the regulations holding it back. Uh, there are regulations that are holding back the private sector from building houses or building solar factories, et cetera, et cetera. You also say that there are regulations stopping the government from building things the government ought to build. So kind of flush this out for me. What are the things that you would prune back in terms of the regulatory structure?
Let me try to break this answer down into three categories, because I think that these laws evolved along sort of three different vectors, almost like sort of think of like three tributaries like feeding into a delta. So just to organize my own thinking here, I want to hit zoning, I want to
Hmm.
hit environmental law, and then I want to hit legal culture because I think
Okay.
they're related but distinct. In the realm of zoning, you know, zoning laws have been around for over a century. The first zoning laws come from California, and they were created in cities around San Francisco in order to zone the city by industry to keep, say, Chinese people who tended to be launderers in those cities away from the white people. They couldn't execute their, ethnic racism based on like burning the Chinese out of their cities. That was plainly illegal. But they found legal ways to essentially zone the Chinese launderers into certain corners of the city.
Hmm.
Zoning for a long time, for many decades, was about this. It was about like taking sort of the pizza pie of the city and chopping it up into zones and organizing it based on certain industries to keep certain industries or poor people or ethnic minorities away from the richest corners of the city. In the 1960s, 1970s, that changed, and zoning became less about cutting up the city into zones and more about creating vast, vast territories where no one could build an apartment building, say single family zoning, or no one could build something in certain areas that were preserved for, say, historic preservation, even if that thing you were preserving was just, say, a strip mall. So zoning shifted from being a way to essentially keep parts of the city away from each other to being ways to stop the general construction of housing across the whole city. That was one evolution that happened in zoning. At the same time, you had this revolution in environmentalism, which I've already somewhat covered, so I'll go quickly through it here. The world of the 1940s, 1950s was absolutely disgusting. The air was disgusting, the water was disgusting, and we needed new environmental laws to respond to how ugly we had made America. We passed a series of laws that not only regulated outcomes like, say, tailpipe emissions, but also changed legal processes in a way that made it easier for individual citizens to use the powers of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, to sue certain projects to force them to do environmental reviews. That is to say, study this project for 9 months or a year or 4.5 years and produce all of this paperwork demonstrating that you will not hurt the environment if you, say, build this apartment here or build the solar plant here. That made it harder to get from the inception of a construction project to the end of the construction project, because now it created a series of environmental review hurdles. And then along a third track, we created a set of legal norms that just made it easier for neighbors to sue to stop any construction around them, the so-called, NIMBYs, not in my backyard, right? A series of circuit court and Supreme Court rules or findings, decisions, essentially codified people's ability to stop private developers from building around them. And so when you put it all together, you have not only the changes in zoning and the changes in environmental review and the changes in permitting all coming together and just making it very, very difficult in many parts of this country to overcome the default, which is it's easy to block projects. It's not easy to complete them.
Hmm. And just want to make sure we've got zoning, and I'm a zoning truther. I've been spreading the gospel of this for a long time. We're fellow travelers in this regard. I'm 100% with you, and everything you said about zoning, I was nodding vigorously. I agree with you on the environmental veto, basically. The legal culture. I want to make sure I understand that. The legal culture is the aforementioned adversarial relationship of kind of giving anybody with sufficient lawyers veto power over building projects, something to that effect?
I think that's a very good summary.
Okay. Well, then let's move on to the government building stuff, because I intuitively understand. I'm on the limited government side of things, so I get the whole regulations are kneecapping private developers. That makes total sense to me, right? I want to talk about how it's stopping the government from doing things. So let's start with this one. Why do Europeans get good trains? Like we don't get bullet trains. We apparently are spending a lot of money on it. What's happening? What are we doing that they're not, or what are they doing that we aren't?
It would be great if this was an easy answer. It'd be great if it was like, oh, like someone did a study and there are exactly 3 reasons why the Europeans or the Japanese build fast trains fast and we build fast trains slow, or actually like don't build fast trains at all when it comes to California's high-speed rail. The truth is it actually seems quite complicated because it's a dynamic system. When there are rules that make it harder to build certain kinds of projects, whether it's a high-speed train or even, say, a nuclear power plant, what happens is not only are you stopping the construction of that individual project, you're also making it harder for builders to learn how to build quickly, right? Think about the learning by doing act or learning by doing process of a computer chip, right? There's this idea of Moore's law, which essentially says that every 18 months, the density of transistors on a semiconductor doubles. Why? Why is there Moore's law for computer chips, but no Moore's law for, say, high-speed rail trains or nuclear power plants? No learning curves there. Well, in part, it's because when you can create an environment, like, say, a manufacturing plant, where you're making the same thing over and over and over and over again, you can learn how to cut the wafer a little bit thinner, how to execute this, how to fit more transistors on the chip, how to do these little things a little bit differently such that you're eking out efficiency gains. But if you have a legal culture that makes it harder to build trains once or harder to build nuclear power plants once, then it becomes harder to learn, it's from the contractor side, it becomes harder for the builders to learn how to build it faster. And so if you compare the US to a place like, say, Lisbon or Madrid, where we found that the costs of building transit is much lower and the speed of building transit is much higher, one thing that I've been told from people who understand European infrastructure better than I do is that politicians run on their record of building infrastructure quickly. So they build part of the Madrid rail system quickly, and then they run on the fact they built quickly, and then they run on building quickly again, and the people who are responsible for building the train are learning from the fact that they built the last stop or the last leg quickly, and now they can build the next leg quickly. What's happened in the US is that we, for reasons I can sort of psychoanalyze, but don't entirely fully understand myself, we're not very good at taking the cultural lesson that we are bad at building. So instead of having a situation where the New York subway system has the most expensive mile of subway construction in the world, about $2 billion per mile, and being embarrassed by that and trying to fix it, instead, we build slowly and build extensively, and then apparently just sort of throw up our hands and say, oh, well, that's just the way things are, and nobody runs on building faster. And so if you want to understand like why American culture is different from, say, Spanish or Portuguese culture when it comes to building high-speed rail, it's not just that we have no one in charge and so there's a diffusion of responsibility. It's not just that we have a permitting issue. It's not just maybe that because we have lower unionization rates, we have a different relationship between the unions and the government. It's all of those things creating a dynamic where because we haven't built lately, we haven't learned how to build faster in the near future. And so it all kind of spools together and creates a dynamic where America has just fallen out of practice with building big projects efficiently. We have nothing to learn from, and so we do not learn.
I am a bit conflicted on this one, not in the sense that I don't want trains. I would like to have trains. The bit that I'm conflicted on is I would assume that a big part of what's holding back the high-speed train in California is that an incredibly costly, time-intensive element is getting the land for the train, because you have to do it through, either have to convince people to sell the land, or you have to go through eminent domain. If you go through eminent domain, you're going to have multiple meetings about it. You're going to have multiple projects written up. Like, eminent domain is a costly process in terms of time and money. But I think I'm okay with that, though. Like, I want the train, but I'm also worried about eminent domain abuses. I want there to be some kind of procedural backstop that the mayor doesn't take my house because he decides it would be better to be a stadium or something like that. So is there a way to square this of my fear of eminent domain abuse with being able to greenlight these projects?
Yeah, I think you pointed to a real tension that exists throughout this book, which is that it would be incredibly dishonest to suggest that there are no trade-offs here. As if you don't use eminent domain, if you don't build a train quickly, there are trade-offs, because now you've authorized $33 billion to build a high-speed rail system that you're not building. And not only are you wasting money, you're also losing the trust of the people who've relied on you to build a high-speed rail system. It's also the case that if you build, if you grow, you are changing the physical environment. Sometimes that might mean eminent domain and people are, being forced, or they're selling their land and they don't necessarily want to, or they're giving away a part of their land they don't necessarily want to, right? There's a clear trade-off there, even if the construction of that high-speed rail is considered a matter of public good, right? So there are trade-offs on either side. And I think it would be dishonest to suggest that the efficient construction of a high-speed rail system wouldn't incur any issues or any political blowback. But what we know now is history as it's transpired. And history as it's transpired is embarrassing enough. It's frankly not the biggest issue, it seems to me, just that the eminent domain question is an important question. But what I'm even more surprised by is the way in which laws that were intended to have a positive progressive effect ironically made it harder to build high-speed rail in the first place.
Like
So, for
NEPA,
example,
things like that.
well, NEPA is just one of them. Of course, NEPA is important. But, in 2009, Barack Obama signs the stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA. And it's not just money spent on local governments and, individuals. That's the recovery part. There's also a reinvestment part. And part of that reinvestment tranche was several $billions to accelerate the construction of high-speed rail, particularly in California. But because there was a rider on that $3 billion that said, we want those $3 billion to be spent on areas that reduce pollution and help low-income people, the rail was moved from the coastline, where it could have connected San Francisco and Los Angeles, which is by far the most beneficial leg of the
The
high-speed
main
rail,
part of the project, yeah.
to Merced Bakersfield, right? To a line in Central California that does not seem to do much of anything and would stimulate very little economic activity. That is because moving inland brings you closer to the more low-income populations of California, and also brings you toward and also helps to meet the part of the Stimulus Act that was designed to affect pollution. And so here's a way in which a law that was designed in order to serve progressive causes ironically moved high-speed rail construction away from from the very line where it would have been most beneficial. And so I think that those are really interesting examples, because when we're crafting laws, we really want to make sure that those laws are achieving outcomes efficiently. Ezra has this term that he coined in the New York Times a few years ago, everything bagel liberalism, which is this, I think, really compelling idea that sometimes progressives, in an attempt to fit all of their progressive priorities into every bill, ironically make it harder for each of those bills to serve their outcomes, right? The ARRA did not build high-speed rail. The Biden rural broadband plan, $42 billion, ended up building very little rural broadband. The $7.5 billion that was in Biden's infrastructure bill for electric vehicle charger stations did not build many electrical vehicle charger stations. And so when you put all of this together, it does just seem like the liberal or progressive instinct to pull all of our priorities into every single piece of legislation has the effect of making it harder to achieve that legislation quickly.
That makes a lot of sense to me. For example, I wish to make solar panels more ubiquitous and cheap. And because I have all of these priorities combined with it, I'm going to put a rider in there that says, when you get my solar panel grant, it has to be installed by a union. All of the parts of the solar panels have to be made in America because we want to help our manufacturers. And pretty soon I've negated the entire thing, where I've ended up, because I have multiple conflicting elements. I'm going to drive up the cost of the thing I was trying to drive the cost down on, at which point it becomes pointless.
Yeah, that's a good example. And this is another case where, with solar panels, it's interesting because the U.S., as we tell the story in the book, the U.S. had the technological frontier of solar panel manufacturing and deployment in the 1970s. Jimmy Carter was putting solar panels on the White House in 1978, 1979. But then Ronald Reagan comes into office. He makes a dentist his Secretary of Energy. Not only takes down America's energy R&D policy, he also literally takes down the solar panels from the White House. And for the next about 30 years, America's solar energy policy is basically kaput. We aren't doing anything in energy R&D. The frontier of the technology moves first to Germany and then finally to China, which now absolutely dominates in terms of solar panel manufacturing. And the U.S. is, at the moment playing catch up. And, this very literal moment, Monday, April 14th, trying to figure out how to tariff certain parts of the solar panel supply chain, because we've realized that, maybe as with computer chips, a key part of America's sort of national security apparatus, not just electronics, but also energy, has to pass through China, which is a geopolitical adversary that could sort of pinch off access to not only us, but all of our allies. This is a really good example of how, again, there are trade-offs. On the one hand, there is an instinct. I can understand a kind of, a globalized libertarian instinct to say whoever can make it cheapest should just make it. The problem with that is that when the country that makes it cheapest also doesn't share your geopolitical goals, then now I think you've put within China a manufacturing supply chain that you consider core to your energy future. Again, that's a trade-off. You followed the money to say this is where it can be made most efficiently, and so we're going to rely on China to make all of them. While the market can see prices, the market can't see, so to speak, whatever fat tail risk there is that China, say, embargoes or surrounds or invades Taiwan and cuts off access to global semiconductors that are, manufactured by TSMC.
Can I pause you for a second, Derek? Only because I've spoken so much about protectionism and tariffs and things like that over the last week. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but I do very much want to talk to you about research and innovation. So the solar panel ones is a good one. You mentioned that in the book that Reagan cuts all the solar funding or significantly reduces it, and America's preeminence within solar power declines. I have a bit of sympathy there in that I want there to be cheap, ubiquitous solar panels, but I do tend to think the government's bad at picking winners and losers. At the same time that this is going on, we start funding bioethanol alcohol because every future presidential candidate in the United States wouldn't dare cut any subsidies to Iowa. So we fund this ridiculous boondoggle that sets us back 30 years. So I can understand somebody coming in and going, look, we're not going to pick winners and losers here. Like I would want you bring up push funding and pull funding in the book, and I really like that. I like pull funding. I would love for the government to go, hey, if you can achieve X, we'll give you money for it.
Most people aren't going to know the difference between push funding and pull funding. So let me define that really quickly.
Yeah.
Push funding is subsidies. Push funding, I think, is what most people think of as research and development spending, right? I want there to be more mRNA vaccines. And so I start paying a bunch of pharmaceutical companies or a bunch of different biotech startups or universities, hey, research more synthetic mRNA pharmaceuticals, right? That's push funding, just giving people money to do the work, the research work, the science, or the manufacturing. There's also pull funding, which I think is really, really interesting. We talk in the book about a particular piece of pull funding that's called an advanced market commitment, AMC, which essentially says, Andrew, let's say that you're building rockets, and I really want you to build rockets because I think rockets are really cool. Push funding is I give you $1 billion and I say use this $1 billion to build your rocket. Pull funding says, Andrew, I'll pay you $10 billion if you can build a rocket that is this high and this fast with this cargo load for this price. If you meet those 4 criteria, I will give you $10 billion. This is essentially how one of the main ways that we accelerated work under Operation Warp Speed on the synthetic mRNA vaccines. We essentially told pharmaceutical companies, even if you're the 17th company to build a COVID vaccine, we will still give you billions of dollars if you develop a COVID vaccine that is this efficacious by this deadline that can help this many people that you can manufacture this much, right? If you make a vaccine that's this successful, we'll guarantee you funding. That's called pull funding. And what's really cool about it, I think, to your point, is that whereas I think a lot of libertarians, and I don't consider myself fully libertarian, but I think some of their ideas are very good, whereas a lot of libertarians are worried about wasting money up front, with pull funding, there's a way in which you'll never waste the money. You're only paying for success. So there's no worry about picking winners and losers, but the pick you thought was a winner ends up losing, and then you lose the entire $500 million push funding that you offered. So I think pull funding is a really clever way for the government to help shape markets where the market function itself is not necessarily getting us to the outcome that we want. And there are just some cases where markets can see a lot, but they're very, very good at seeing pricing. They're very good at seeing demand. They're very good at seeing, near-term inventory. Markets aren't as good at seeing values. And sometimes I think there are political values that we need to show to markets. And pull funding is a really good way of doing that, right? Advanced market commitment for new kinds of medicine, advanced market commitment for maybe new kinds of clean energy technology like carbon removal plants. I think pull funding would be a really, really cool way to essentially, this is sort of the simple way to put it, do Operation Warp Speed for everything. Find ways to accelerate the development of technology that we really think could help our lives.
Sold. I'm with you on this. You've made a compelling case. I like this idea very much. I am the National Institute of Health, or I'm the one of the various federal funding arms, and I go, if you guys can make getting a payload into space 5% cheaper than our current thing, and you meet these safety criteria, then we'll just give you $10 billion for it. I like it. It's very smart. You talk about in the book that there's a tremendous amount of red tape that currently goes into scientists. They spend about 40% of their time filling out forms. Is the alternative to that to pull funding, or is it just to go, we trust you? Because I don't want to just give money to universities and go, we trust you, you're fine. I think that there will be fat and loss to that. So are you wanting to do both? Are you wanting to remove the process and just go, scientists, you're all good people. Take the money. We're sure good stuff will come out of this. We don't think that you will go on vacation with it. Or is it, we'll do the pull funding because that means we get the thing in the end. The outcome's already baked into it. We don't need to worry about the process to get there. Unpack this for me, please.
Science is experiments. That's what science is. Science is not knowing the answer to certain questions and then running experiments. And the irony with America's science policy is that we don't run very many experiments, right? We have the NIH, which I think has done absolutely extraordinary work. I mean, since World War II, the NIH has basically gotten its fingerprints on 99% of every biomedical breakthrough in the last 80 years. It's amazing. But the NIH, in its current state, is an 80-year-old bureaucracy. And it's developed the habits of 80-year-old bureaucracies. It tends to fund conservative research over high-risk, high-reward research. It tends to fund older researchers rather than younger researchers. It tends to waste scientists' time by forcing them to spend an enormous amount of time on working on grants or on filling out paperwork. As you quoted, 40% of the typical scientist's time these days is spent on filling out grants or filling out paperwork, which is pretty astonishing when you think about it.
Oh, it's crazy. If you think about if the best brain surgeon in the world had to spend 40% of her time filling out paperwork about brain surgery, this could be better spent doing more brain surgery, right? So, ditto with the scientist. I agree. There's a tremendous amount of bureaucracy there.
So yeah, I think, and a lot of these rules we wrote. Right, in many cases, you go back to the 1950s and you look at what the NIH presidents were saying or NIH directors were saying in that time. They were saying things like, "Man, the NIH looks like it's set up to succeed in so many beautiful ways, but God, it would really be a shame if the NIH just became a way to fund conservative science over high risk, high reward science, or just became a way to reward already successful scientists, or just became a way to waste scientists' time by checking boxes." And all of these things, to a certain extent, have come true. And so it's an interesting time to make this complaint because I think some people hear me clearly and some people hear me in a more confused way. Um, the Trump administration right now is not reforming the NIH. It's just slamming into the NIH with a wrecking ball and using its leverage over major universities to wrest concessions that, make Trump or whoever else in the White House happy. That's not a science policy. That's much more like an ideological purge that happens to find science in the crosshairs. What I'm saying is, I think that progressives and liberals should be as obsessed with science policy as they are with taxing and spending. I mean, what makes people's lives better? Right? Ultimately, if what you want to do is remove human suffering as a progressive, right? And that's what taxing and welfare states are. You are, eliminating poverty. You are reducing, human suffering. Well, medicine reduces human suffering tremendously. Medical technology reduces human suffering tremendously. I mean, I've been watching the HBO show The Pit recently, which is this absolutely wonderful but sometimes very photorealistic and gruesome show on HBO Max about an ER in which basically one crazy thing happens after another. At any given scene, you can stop the frame and point to a piece of technology that was invented in like the last 50, 60 years, right? So none of these things, many of these technologies didn't even exist when, Medicare and Medicaid were created in 1965. Being able to invent new things in science and technology is incredibly important, and I think we've gotten in the way of doing it. So sorry, to return to the first question that you asked, what should be our approach here? I think that science is about experiments. And NIH is not as experimental as it should be. We should be trying and testing and gathering data on a range of different ways to fund scientific inquiries into the unknown. We should test our current strategy. We should also, I think, just give some scientists money for 15 years and say, see ya, we're not going to talk to you until it's, whatever, 2040. We should also use what's sometimes called like a golden ticket, where, Andrew, if you and I are on a panel, a peer review panel, you hate the idea, I love it, I can still guarantee that that project's going to be funded because I have one golden ticket to reward, so that even if the peers around me don't like the idea, if I really, really love it, I can make sure that it's given some grant money. I think we should have much more money deliberately spent on young scientists because they tend to have ideas that are sort of unconstrained by conventional wisdom. We should try a bunch of different experiments and then measure them, because science is so important, and it's just kind of crazy that 80 years into the NIH's most recent sort of instantiation, we're still not like entirely clear on like how the NIH does its best work. We kind of just don't know. I think we should run projects, run experiments much more aggressively than we are.
I'm going to push back a little bit on you, noting that I like the pull demand stuff, and I would be happy to fund pull demand stuff. With the NIH, I see there being a trade-off there, or with any federal funding, that I don't know how to. This isn't even pushback. I see an inherent problem here in terms of trade-offs, where I am a federal agency. I am allocating money to research. I think there's always going to be a conservative pressure there because you're spending taxpayer dollars. So the federal dispenser of funds, have an incentive on me to make sure that there are gains from the money. And that means that I'm going to go for things that are small grind incremental increases that are likely to have a positive outcome but not be very big, rather than take a big swing and a miss. Because if I take a swing and a miss, people go, well, you just wasted a bunch of taxpayer funding, and I get in trouble for it. So is the idea that we just need to be okay with higher failure rates? Yeah. The golden ticket thing, I think, is actually a pretty good deal of like maybe 90% of the funding is very basic incremental, but we give 10% for shoot the moon type stuff. I don't know, how would you, is it just be more okay with failure?
No, you're very, very smart to point to this tension, and it is a tension. And again, I want to say for whatever the third or 30th time on this show, because it really is a theme of this book. Politics is trade-offs, and economics is trade-offs. And frankly, you shouldn't trust anybody who tells you that they've come up with a policy idea that is perfect and incurs no trade-offs. That's a very clear sign that they're lying to you and not telling you the truth about their policy. Yeah. Every single idea that we have in this book has a new set of trade-offs. If you take a city that doesn't build housing and you build more housing, you're going to piss off NIMBYs. Trade-off. If you take a world that isn't building clean energy and you build more clean energy, that requires land. Land use involves trade-offs because many times it's the government or the private sector that owns that land, and someone might want to do something else with it. Trade-off. In science, right now, I think we have a sort of policy regime that is lower risk, lower reward, maybe in a way, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, to protect scientists from the accusation of folks in government or around government that the NIH is wasting money. Okay, there's one trade-off. But there's another trade-off, as you said, if you go too high risk, high reward, and people feel like it's just a bunch of, shrimp running on treadmills, that the NIH has just turned into like a bunch of stupid science experiments. But here's what I would ask you.
Uh-huh.
What would you say is the most important drug discovery, right? New drug category that's come online in the last 1 to 5 years? Like what's the buzziest new drug that people are talking about? Let's say maybe in the realm of obesity.
I was about to say Ozempic. I don't know what the timeline is, but Ozempic's what's popped into my mind, yeah.
Okay, so GLP-1 drugs, glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists, GLP-1 RAs. Where did that work come from?
I don't know.
It came in the 1990s from scientists curious about the Gila monster, a venomous lizard that can survive by only eating a few times a year. Scientists wanted to understand what was in its saliva. Maybe it had some kind of insulin regulation system that was unique to that organism. They studied the Gila monster's saliva. They synthesized it. They created a GLP-1 that was used for type 2 diabetes. Over time in phase 2 or in phase 3 clinical trials, it was observed that people who were type 2 diabetic on this drug were losing weight. It was later tested specifically for weight loss. Yada, yada, yada. You now have Ozempic and Wegovy, which is the GLP-1 that's specifically for. There's lots of other GLP-1s that are specifically for weight loss. And it goes far beyond that because now it seems like the anti-obesity, anti-inflammation properties of GLP-1 drugs might even be beneficial for inflammation,
alcoholism,
for heart disease,
yeah, like
for
all sorts of things,
alcoholism, for Alzheimer's, even for schizophrenia symptoms. Where did this all start? Why do we know any of this? Because someone was stupid enough to open up a venomous lizard's mouth and say, I wonder what the liquid stuff is on its tongue. These are the kind of stories that the scientific world needs to tell to defend weird science. Because
So if I was going to put
understanding the world requires sometimes asking questions that sound really, really stupid. There's a bunch of other examples from here. Like, CRISPR technology, for example, which in many ways is the most popular and promising gene editing technology. CRISPR technology started with a bunch of Spanish and Japanese researchers trying to figure out how bacteria responded to viral infections. Like, who cares? Why are we studying bacteria? Like, why do we care about bacteria? Well, it turns out that they had a gene editing function that we've now been able to slurp into mammalian species. So I say all of this in order to argue for weird science. If you think GLP-1 drugs are interesting, you should be interested in the reason we have them. And we have them because someone was crazy enough to look inside the mouth of a lizard.
That is fascinating. And you've given me a new paradigm to think with. It almost reminds me of angel investing. By the way, I'm not an angel investor. I'm a podcaster. I don't have that kind of money. But when I talk to angel investors, my understanding is that kind of the way they approach things is we're going to fund 15 different things, knowing that 14 of them are going to be abysmal failures, but one of them might be Facebook. So if I were a federal administrator talking to people, I'd go, look, this is how this is going to work. A lot of these are going to be dead ends, but we're not investing in gravel companies where we can expect to get 1% profit going forward. We're going to get one of these that'll be a shoot the moon that will more than justify the dead ends elsewhere. So it's not just that we're throwing the money away. It's we're taking big swings, big risks. There's going to be big failures, but there's going to be really big successes. And overall, they will balance out the other stuff. It'll be a net positive for us that way.
I think it's a great metaphor. And I think that if you talk to angel or VCs, you'll hear them talk about diversity of risk within a portfolio. Right? If you're betting on 20 companies, you probably don't want all of those companies to be like Airbnb, but for X, right? Because then you're just making 20 bets that are a very similar bet, and you're not protected across betting categories. It makes more sense to say, I'm going to have some bets that are low risk, low reward. I'm going to have some bets that are medium, medium. I'll have some bets that are high, high. And I think that the NIH should think in a very similar way. I don't believe in like the VCification of everything, but I do think that a portfolio should have a distribution of risk. Investing portfolio should have a distribution of risk too. And I would like to see the NIH and frankly the government be a little bit more interested in diversifying its risk across these betting portfolios.
So one more pushback, and then we'll wrap up on this. In terms of just we're just going to give money to scientists and take it for 15 years. We want to see something interesting come out of that. We had a lot of scandals in the 1990s of federal funding to higher ed, Ivy League universities, where the way it works is we give the grant, but they're allowed to charge a certain percentage for overhead. And they blew it. Like Stanford literally used money for overhead, for keeping the lights on and janitorial staff overhead. They used it to buy a yacht. They had administrators go on vacations to Paris. They had somebody use it was graft.
And indirect costs. Yeah.
Indirect costs, right? So I'm very hesitant to just go, we're going to give you a big block sum. Let us know what you come up with it. Is your perspective like, look, that's probably going to happen, but it's net positive. It's better to get the big stuff, even if an administrator squanders some of the money personally, or
Good clarification. Let me draw a really clear distinction. I'm talking about experiments with direct funding of scientists. Okay. You're talking about the problem of indirect costs, which is that, when the NIH, you, Andrew, you apply, you say, I want to do more research on, Gila monster sounded interesting. I'm going to do some research on geckos, let's say. All right. So the government says, we're going to give you $1 million for geckos, but the indirect cost of your university is 50%. So we're also going to give you $500,000 for your university, let's say. That 50% direct cost policy could be inappropriate. Right. I don't know enough about the necessary indirect cost of every single institution to be able to say what the right number is. But that number could be inappropriate. It frankly has nothing to do with the $1 million that's awarded to you. That's what I'm interested in reforming when it comes to the NIH. The indirect cost stuff, I think, is important and interesting, but I do not write about it. And it very well might be the case that as opposed to the Trump administration wanting to set all the indirect costs at 15%, look, maybe the right level is 20. Maybe the right level is 22 for some universities and 37 for research universities like Johns Hopkins. I do not know. That's not my expertise. I'm interested in running a bunch of experiments for the direct funding of science.
Okay. Final questions for you, two-parter. A quick one, what is state capacity? And then the final kickoff question, then we'll end this, is if we were going to scrap the fairly common big government liberal versus small government conservative paradigm and replace it with a different way of looking at things moving forward, what would you prefer people embrace?
Fortunately, these are basically the same question. So state capacity is the ability of government to do what it says it wants to do quickly. That's state capacity. So if you think about how's our state capacity with Social Security? Well, we send out tens of millions of checks with a very, very low fraud rate. We collect the taxes in an efficient way. We spend them in an efficient way. State capacity in Social Security, I'd say, is quite high. If you look at state capacity for building in the physical world, it's quite low, right? The Biden administration says we want to build rural broadband. We want to build EV charger stations. California says they want to build a high-speed rail. Our state capacity for building stuff in the physical world is quite low. So state capacity is the ability of government to do what it says it wants to do to achieve its goals in an expeditious way. And I think it sets me up for part number 2, which is that rather than think about government being big versus small, I think the question should be, is government efficient or inefficient? Is government fast or slow? Right? When government says, we're going to change COLA, cost of living adjustments, on your Social Security checks, does it take 5 years to calculate COLA? No. They calculate it in 2 weeks, and then they just change the checks. Right? That's an efficient system. And it's a relatively straightforward system because it's just, collecting money from taxpayers and sending it out to particularly old folks. But state capacity in other areas, it takes forever, right? I mentioned rural broadband and EV charger stations and obviously high-speed rail. I like the idea of thinking about government fast and slow rather than thinking about government so exclusively through this binary or axis of big versus small.
Wonderful. Derek, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I enjoyed your book. The book we've been discussing is Abundance, which you can find wherever you buy books and on Amazon, but make it easy for yourself. Go to mightyheat.com/featured. And Derek, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Derek Thompson, for coming on to discuss abundance. Thank you, patrons who make the whole show possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.